Hi everybody, we're going to talk fabric patterns today. We just printed our pattern, so we're going to talk about making sure that we printed the right size, how to cut it properly, how to assemble it properly, and then once we have it assembled, how to interpret all of these symbols and signs on top of it, and then cutting it and pinning it to a piece of fabric so that we can make a beautiful garment.
Imagine you've just come back from the printer and you have your pieces printed out. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that even though in your file, which is probably a PDF, all the lines go until the edge of the page, right? But once you print them out, every printer is always going to leave a kind of a margin. You would have to cut that off for you to be able to attach the pieces together in a nice way.
And before we do that, how can we assure that we've printed this in the right size? Because our printer might accidentally resize it or something. Isn't there a way for us to determine that this is the right size?
For this specific pattern, they offer a kind of a reference point where this little square is supposed to measure 2 inches. It says it right here. So once you print out this first page, print just the first one and measure this little pattern. And if it's 2 inches, then you can print the rest of it as well.
And other patterns may be different. This is just the example from Mood Fabrics.
Yeah, exactly. And so once you have all your printed pieces, these are the pages that you should have. So for example, for this specific pattern, you have 18 pages. But for the sake of showing you how to cut the edges of these specific pages, we've just printed out 4.
Perfect. And now we're going to go, we're going to skip ahead and cut these.
Yes. So your first instinct might be to cut off all the edges, but don't do that. So here what we've done is we've cut only the upper and the left edge of your page. So when you assemble them together, here on page number 2, you will still have this little edge left here where you can easily then kind of glue it on. I like to use a glue stick first. Kind of like a cross almost. So you have to make sure that those align in a nice way.
One thing I notice you doing with both the cutting and the assembling is that you're being very precise. The line that you cut right here is very precise. When you assemble these together, you're being very precise.
Also, I tried to think of it of kind of a puzzle almost. This is the picture that we're putting together, and these are our pieces. So keep in mind that the order of the pages is important, and also here how you can see, for example, page 7, it does not come after 6, it comes under 1.
So now you've glued these 3 pieces together as just an example, and now you're going to flip it over?
Yeah, I'm going to flip it over and add some masking tape. I like to work with masking tape because it still holds pretty nicely, but even if you do make a little mistake and kind of like it gets stuck to the paper, it doesn't get stuck that much. You can always remove it a little bit and kind of correct your little mistake that you did. Looks like we've assembled everything, and so this paper has a lot of information, and it's important to pay attention to all of those little details. As you can see, there are like multiple lines, and each of them represent a different size. This specific pattern goes from size 34 to 52. In one of those pages that you printed out, there's a little kind of a measurement size chart. So before you cut anything out, you should define what your size is. And on this pattern, each size corresponds to a different type of line. When you look closely, there's just a dashed line, there's a line that is a dash dot, etc. So each of them is a bit different. So once you've determined your size, you're gonna cut only that specific type of line.
Now we've traced everything, so there's no mistaking what we're going to cut when we pull out our scissors, and that's what we're going to do now. But before we do that, let's make sure that we can interpret all of these words and symbols on this page, because clearly this piece of paper is trying to communicate some information to us.
Well, one important thing is the grain line. You can see this arrow here. In fabrics that are woven, you have two grain lines. One is vertical and one is horizontal. Usually when fabric is produced, it has a certain width. And when it's stored later on, it's stored in rolls. There is this kind of a strange looking edge that you can kind of recognize. And your straight grain line goes parallel to that edge. Whereas your crossing grain line goes from one, like horizontally. And so the straight grain line is usually more sturdy one, the strongest one, whereas the horizontal one has a little bit more stretch to it. There is also bias, which in this pattern piece we don't really need, but it's a good thing to know. Sometimes it also says cut on bias, because that's the 45-degree angle. And it is, as you can see, if you pull it this way, it stretches a lot more. And that's why it's important when you place your pattern pieces to not place them in an angle, because then your final garment is gonna stretch or hang in a weird way. So you will notice that this is a t-shirt, like a pretty basic garment. So you would have the front, and you have only one of that. And you will have the back, which is also just one piece. Whereas here, this piece is for the sleeves, and those you need to cut 2 times.
In this one that says cut unfold, we'll take a look at that in a moment after we've cut this, but we're almost there. What are these little T marks?
Yeah, so those are these little notches that kind of help you to align your pattern pieces together in a correct way. So you will notice that you have one here and also one on the other side here, because this is the side seam of your t-shirt, and once you place it together, you will want these to match together.
This is great. So if I'm not precise in cutting my fabric, this line may end up weird compared to this line, but if I use this as my reference, everything lines up right. Yeah?
Yes.
I notice one here and one on my neckline. Yeah? Does that seem right?
Yes. However, I think this one is the center back, so this should also be center back is here.
I see that you're looking at the words on the paper.
Here on the sleeve as well, you have a shoulder notch. Where it's going to be located on your pattern is kind of here, because that's where this is your shoulder seam, where your fabric is going to be attached together, and so this part is kind of attached here. So I've started to pin my pattern piece. It's important when you pin to go all the way through the fabric and
yeah, I saw you go through the paper and 2 layers of fabric and then back through.
Back through.
So the question I just asked Alma was that could we just cut this right now as it is and not have to use this tailor's chalk to trace it and then cut it? And she said we could, but then I heard you say that it's a good practice to maybe trace all of my pieces on my entire fabric and then have everything laid out just to double check that I have everything in place, and then I can cut it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, and then I imagine that you're going to want to transfer this to the inside, right? Okay.
Once the fabric is cut out, I still have them there.
Okay, so now we've taken the pattern off. These pieces of fabric are now separated because they're not pinned anymore. So what we're going to do is pin the fabric back together, which is a common practice, right? So again, we can have everything laid out on our fabric, and then we'll cut it. Okay, so you've traced this beautifully. You've marked the things here that we need to account for when we put our pieces together, but you said that we have not accounted for a very special thing in sewing, which is the seam allowance. Tell us about a seam allowance.
Yes, so in this specific pattern, so like, because patterns differ from one another, but this specific brand already includes your seam allowance in your pattern piece. And so basically, your cutting line is the one that we've marked here, but your sewing line is going to be about 1 centimeter inwards.
Okay, so here we're sewing on once we've cut this, we sew about a centimeter on the inside of that.
Yeah.
And what did you say about our sewing machine that helps us out with that?
Yeah, and so on your sewing machine, you have your presser foot. So you would often use that like the edge of the presser foot as your kind of guidance. Like your presser foot's edge would go along the cutting line.